Welcome, everyone. My name is Frank Reedy, and I'm representing the Strategic Studies Department here at JSOU. Today, we're pleased to present a conversation with a distinguished guest, including audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the Department of Defense, U.S. government, or USOCOM. If you have feedback or questions after this session, email thinkjsou@socom.mil as indicated on the slide. Today's moderator is Dr. Pete McCabe, a resident senior fellow here at JSOU. He will introduce the program and today's guest.
Thanks, Frank. My name is Peter McCabe, and I'm a resident senior fellow at Joint Special Operations University located here in Tampa, Florida. I want to welcome everyone to another online interview of Think JSOU. Think JSOU is an ongoing series that explores research and publications of JSOU faculty, resident senior fellows, leading academics, and the wider SOF and international security community. The online collection includes interviews and conversations with authors and researchers. It is intended to supplement existing publications, articles, and other active discussions. I encourage everyone to explore the complete Think JSOU collection by reviewing our online offerings posted to the All Partner Access Network, or APAN, and available for streaming from our library and social media sites. For our online attendees, if you do have a question for our guest, please submit the question at any time using the Q&A icon on your toolbar. Today, we are honored to have Professor John Lewis Gaddis join us to discuss the topic of grand strategy in general and his book titled On Grand Strategy. John Lewis Gaddis is the Robert A. Lovett Professor of Military and Naval History at Yale University, where he teaches courses on the Cold War, grand strategy, biography, and historical methods. His books include The Cold War, A New History, a new edition of Strategies of Containment, a critical appraisal of post-war American national security policy, and George F. Kennan in American Life. Professor Gaddis has received 2 awards for undergraduate teaching at Yale, as well as the National Humanities Medal and the 2012 Pulitzer Prize for Biography. Professor Gaddis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Pete. It's a pleasure to be here. Look forward to the discussion.
We also. Besides reading your book, I also enjoyed reading reviews of your book. My favorite is the New York Times review by Victor Davis Hanson, in which he wrote, 10 lively essays proceed in chronological order from King Xerxes' invasion of Greece to Isaiah Berlin's thoughts on World War II and the Cold War. In all of them, Gaddis keeps pounding to the point of monotony the seemingly self-evident. The grand strategist must prune away emotion, ego, and conventional wisdom to accept that if you seek ends beyond your means, then sooner or later you'll have to scale back your ends to fit your means. His repetitious observation about proportionality might have been banal if so many leaders, many of them geniuses, had not forgotten it. Professor, the reviewer gives you a bit of a poke there, but also acknowledges that leaders forget the most basic lesson: to live within your means. Why do you believe that is so hard to remember?
I thought that was an interesting review that kind of walked a fine line. Like the way it started out, I didn't too much like the business about being monotonous or the business about being banal, but he brought it around, I guess, in the end. I could have done without those qualifications, but that was, on balance, a reasonably good review.
It was. I think he really got to the heart of it, and certainly our national debt is a great example of why our government can't seem to live within their means. But sir, I'd like to ask you a question about your motivation to write this book on grand strategy, since the subject has been covered by so many.
Sure.
What did you see as what was lacking in those other volumes that prompted you to write on grand strategy?
Well, this book actually came out of teaching. It came out of teaching our undergraduate seminar in grand strategy, which I've done here with Charlie Hill and Paul Kennedy for almost 20 years now. And that in turn was based on the prototype of the Thucydides Naval War College curriculum, which goes back to the 1970s, established by the late Admiral Stansfield Turner. The premise of both the Newport course and the premise of our course is that there is some reason why people keep coming back to classical texts. They don't go out of style. They don't go out of fashion. They don't fade from the woodwork. There's something in them that people find useful. And this would be true of Thucydides. It's true of Pericles' funeral address. It's true of Machiavelli. It's certainly true of Clausewitz. And so part of what our seminar was trying to do was to introduce our undergraduates to those classical texts and to the principles of strategy that come out of them. And part of the purpose of the seminar, as was the case with the purpose of the book, was to see what common threads run through that 2,500 some odd years of history, on the premise that if it's that durable, then there must be something of value in it, and it proceeded from there. So the basic conclusion, the bottom line, really has to do with my definition of grand strategy, which is not Paul Kennedy's definition and it's not Charlie Hill's definition. Three of us were never able to agree on anything. But my definition has always been the alignment of limited capabilities with unlimited aspirations. Aspirations can be anything. Capabilities can never be everything. And so how you align those things is something that everybody has got to do in all spheres of life and across all time and space and culture, it seems to me. So that's the starting point. It's a very simple idea. But as Victor Hansen said, it's amazing how often it gets lost sight of by people who claim to be very smart. And so the book has some disaster stories in it as well to illustrate that principle.
Yeah, I think that's what I took away as well, sir, that, you know, so many smart people that you've covered throughout that book, and they keep forgetting to check out what they're trying to achieve and what they have to do that with. And, so in your book, you discuss foxes and hedgehogs as it relates to experts. Can you describe the distinction between the two and how it relates to grand strategy or strategists?
This is an old distinction that goes back to the ancient Greeks, but it was revived by the British philosopher Isaiah Berlin in the 1950s, mostly applied to literary purposes, but I think it has, and Berlin himself argued, has a wider application. The basic idea is the fox knows many things, the hedgehog knows one big thing, and humanity is divided between those two critters, those two animals. That's a vast oversimplification, of course, no question about that. But as Berlin said, it's a starting point for analysis, and I found it very useful in going through these classical case studies. Because as I did that, it seemed to me that the strategists who were successful were the ones who kept their eyes on many things at once. And the ones who flamed out or exhausted themselves or their armies or their countries were often the ones that did so in the name of some single idea that drove them into ignoring this relationship between capabilities and aspirations. And so that applies to Xerxes invading Greece in 480 BC. It applies to the Sicilian expedition of the Athenians. It applies to the Romans in the Teutoburg forest when they got creamed by the Germans in AD 9, I think. It certainly applies to Philip II of Spain with the Spanish Armada. And of course, most vividly, it applies to Napoleon. We used to have a principle in Newport. One thing you need to remember always is don't march to Moscow. And this is something that Napoleon should have known better than to do, but he did it. And so all of these are very good case studies of what happens when that relationship is ignored. And conversely, it implies that the successful grand strategist is the fox-like figure who keeps his or her eye on many things and not just one single thing.
Yeah, you know, there are a lot of memorable quotes from your book, but one of my favorites is common sense is like oxygen. The higher you go, the thinner it gets. And so how can grand strategy help leaders at all levels with common sense?
Well, this grows out of some much more recent social psychological research. The political scientist, psychologist Phil Tetlock got interested in the fox-hedgehog dichotomy from an attempt to study prediction and why some predictions succeed and why others fail. And he tried to run all kinds of correlations that would explain this, none of which made any sense except the fox-hedgehog distinction. And those decision makers who self-identified as foxes had a pretty good record on prediction, much better than those decision makers who self-identified as hedgehogs. But Phil Tetlock pointed out a dilemma, a kind of a puzzle, that it seemed to be the hedgehogs who rose higher in hierarchies in organizations and in responsibilities than the foxes did. And he thought about this a good deal and decided it was because the hedgehogs are good at sound bites. The hedgehogs are good at writing short memos. The hedgehogs are good at oversimplifying concepts and presenting them before the commercial break. You know? And the foxes, when they're interviewed, just go on and on and on. And they say, on the one hand this, and on the other hand that, and so on and so forth, or in a high-powered decision-making situation, they would be the ones who would qualify everything so that no clear recommendation comes out. And while they are often right about this, they do ignore one other reality, which is there has to be somebody who determines on a sense of direction and points the whole organization or the whole country or whatever in one direction. You can't go in multiple directions at once. So how you balance these things, how you keep your eye on a lot of different things at once and still find some sense of purpose and direction is, it seems to me, yet another way of defining strategy. But the common sense is simply coming back to the fundamental definition of strategy, the always inevitable, inescapable gap between capabilities and aspirations. And the lack of common sense is most often what happens when you forget this, maybe because you've risen too fast, too far in some hierarchy somewhere.
Your description of foxes qualifying everything, we call those military intelligence officers, you know, so just.
Right. All right. Yes, indeed. Sure.
So you ask a great question in your book, sir. You ask, so is it possible to teach grand strategy, or at least the common sense that sustains it? How does the academy, or more specifically the professional military education system, teach grand strategy?
Well, I think there's a very good answer to that, which is yes and no, both. Yes, in the sense that there is an extensive database out there. In fact, there are two databases out there. One database is what the social scientists will conclude through their experiments and number crunching and all of that. The other database is the historical database, which goes back a very long way. And of course, that's what we prefer to focus on. And we think it's less focused on than the number crunching database. But that can be taught, that can be conveyed to students in a book or in a seminar or in a lecture or whatever. What can't be taught are the contingencies that our students or your officers are going to run into after they leave our respective institutions. what lies ahead for them in life. There's a whole separate sphere of responsibility, a sphere of responsibility out there, which they will confront, which is the realm of surprise. And nobody will ever be able to predict exactly what's going to happen. So the task is to have principles in mind, for sure, but to realize, as Clausewitz said, that sometimes the first thing you do when you get into a conflict is throw the principles out the window, because they're never going to apply specifically or mechanically to the situation that you are confronting.
Sir, related question. The Joint Chiefs of Staff recently released their vision and guidance for Office of Professional Military Education, calling for a change in philosophy and tightly tying performance to assignments. Their aim, and this is a quote, the development of strategically minded joint warfighters who think critically and can creatively apply military power to inform national strategy, conduct globally integrated operations, and fight under conditions of disruptive change. These are pretty lofty goals. How can the military schools achieve this?
Well, it's just basic Clausewitz, really. Clausewitz was the supreme grand strategist of all time, because he, more than anyone else, was able to take, on the one hand, training and see the importance of training, meaning that you acquire the database, the historical database. You draw on the experience of those who have gone before, but who gave, Clausewitz gave equal weight to what he called friction, or the unexpected, or the realm of surprise, or fear, or terror, or irrationality, which will come up in any kind of a situation. And he, more than anyone else, wrote about how we can coexist with these two tendencies. The problem is that he wrote this in an unreadable book on war. First of all, it was published in German, so that's a problem. And secondly, it was incomplete when Clausewitz died, so it's infuriating to read it. It appears to contradict itself. And so I have always looked for a way to explain Clausewitz to students. And the way I've finally come around to doing it is that Clausewitz is a coach. They all know about coaches. They all know about these guys who train them, put them through rigorous training, something like drill instructors in the military, put them through all of this. But they also know that when they get out on the playing field, or when you get out into a combat zone, the reality that you'll face will not be everything that you planned for the simple reason there is another team, or there is another enemy out there. Things are not going to go in the way that you expected. So it becomes necessary for you to improvise. But nobody would say of anyone playing basketball or baseball or football that they would play it better for having never been coached. The coaching somehow was useful. And I think that's where the strategy comes in. The strategy is a form of coaching, which is not going to tell you what to do, but it helps to prepare you for what to do. It teaches certain things about temperament, about discipline, about courage, about generalization, about how to look at everything, but then determine on a course of action, and to do it very quickly. In a way that the coach cannot tell you how to do. You have to decide this for yourself. And that gets back to what the new guidance from DOD, I think, is focusing on, which is that this kind of sophistication should exist at all ranks, not just at the top. And that's one of the things that's been characteristic of the American military, is the willingness to have that happen at the all the way down through the hierarchy. As opposed to the complete top-down model. And I'm happy to see that principle reiterated. I think it's very important. It's perfectly consistent with this view of Clausewitz as a coach, I think.
Great, sir. I'd like to move to some questions from the audience, since they're rolling in now. The first, sir, how do you see the difference between national security strategies and grand strategies, or do you see them as the same?
I think there's no clear line in between them. We often in our seminars make a distinction between grand strategies and petite strategies. So a petite strategy might be something like, well, where do you go in New Haven to get a good pizza or something like that? You know? But a grand strategy can be whatever is important to you. So starting out as a student, it's important what professors you take. It's important what major you choose. It's very important who you fall in love with. These are all grand strategic issues for young people. And then as young people rise in positions of authority, their responsibilities expand and the whole sphere becomes broader. And the concept of grand strategy, some of the same principles of grand strategy would apply there as well. And part of the trick is to avoid the great danger of the hedgehog and lose common sense as your altitude increases. And that's a rare skill. The ability to continue to do this, to continue to make that link between aspirations and capabilities, no matter what your level of responsibilities actually are. And that's the big issue, it seems to me.
I'll go on to another audience question here. How would you characterize General Chanesky's congressional testimony when he said that it would take 500,000 troops to invade Iraq and then was fired? It appears he thought the means were insufficient for the ends, yet when he spoke up was fired. And I assume that that's where it ends, but I assume the questioner is asking, you know, how do we get to be a great strategist when you know, when you do speak up, is it just a political issue?
I think the lesson is don't entrust your strategy to hedgehogs. and that's what was done back in that period. The Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, unfortunately, in approaching dealing with the issue of Iraq, turned that into a gigantic hedgehog and said that this was the most dangerous issue that was out there. We know now that it was a massive intelligence failure, but this is what happens when hedgehogs go unchallenged. And that's what was happening in that situation. You know, there was no room for, at the top, for qualification, for dissent. And I think that many of the people in that administration, in retrospect, regret it having been that way, for sure.
I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the growing chorus of academics who either believe the current grand strategy models are wrong or are not needed at all. So specifically, Jeffrey Miser critiques the U.S. defense community's formula for strategy, which he summarizes as ends plus ways plus means equals strategy. Others, such as Michael Fuchs, claims the U.S. does not need a grand strategy, but a number of strategies to focus on priorities. So how do you respond to these critics of grand strategy?
I know a lot of academics who lack common sense.
Okay, we'll leave it there. So getting back to your book on grand strategy, you mentioned that grand strategy helps one with proportionality and helps define what grand strategy is. And you mentioned it already, the alignment of potentially infinite aspirations with necessarily limited capabilities. In our currently divided political environment, how can the US move forward with a grand strategy?
Well, it's tough in the chaotic environment that we have. It comes with being a democracy, for one thing. And certainly politics are polarized in this country. But this is where a historical perspective, it seems to me, becomes important. Politics in this country have been polarized off and on since the founding of the Republic. They were certainly polarized in the early days of the Washington, Adams, and Jefferson administrations, for example. They were certainly polarized in the run-up to the Civil War. They were polarized in the aftermath of World War I and so on. And yet in each of these situations in time, impressive leaders were able to rally some kind of a consensus. Sometimes it took an external attack to do this, like the British burning the White House in 1814, or the attack on Fort Sumter in 1861, or obviously Pearl Harbor in 1941. One hopes it does not have to take that kind of a crisis. It often has. But it's not a completely hopeless situation. Democracies have a resilience, it seems to me, a recovery capability that authoritarian states simply don't have. And I think that's still just as true as it was back in the 1930s and has been at other times as well. It's just in the current cacophony, extremely hard to see that. And certainly the advent of Twitter and tweeting and chatter and all of that stuff is a distraction. But go back and read the press in the age of Hamilton and Burr. Look what they did to each other. And you get some sense of this not being a completely unprecedented situation.
Okay, good point. So I'll go back to some of the audience questions because they're rolling in. One can argue that many of the hedgehog-like grand strategies of the past, such as those of Clausewitz, are limited by being based on narrow and linear thinking to maneuver warfare. How do the problems of the modern world and the concepts of complexity and compound problems change the nature of strategy? Do we need a better fox?
Well, I don't think these problems change much. Technology changes. There's no question about that. But it seems to me that the dilemmas remain pretty much the same. I'm very sorry about that ambient noise across the street. That's somebody with a buzzsaw on Bishop Street. The dilemmas remain much the same, it seems to me. So I simply come back to the fundamental principle that this issue transcends time, space, culture, and technological advance in many ways. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that's satisfactory, but I think it's true.
Sure. Another question from the audience. A lot of focus on Greek culture and thinkers, European, but what about Eastern philosophy, in particular Sun Tzu? Are there contradictions? Please share thoughts.
Mm-hmm. We always did Sun Tzu in the Grand Strategy course, and he was very popular with the students because The Art of War is a very short book, and they like that compared to Thucydides or Clausewitz or whatnot. And Sun Tzu is also full of aphorisms, and it's very easy to memorize those aphorisms. The only thing that's a bit frustrating about Sun Tzu is when you put his aphorisms side by side, they often come out as platitudes, water flows downhill, that kind of thing, well, big news. Except that then he will say something like, armies must do the same. And that gets into economy of force, that gets into the use of terrain, that gets into being aware of your surroundings, situational consciousness, all of these kinds of things, which are quite sophisticated concepts. So it's a useful book in that sense. There is, however, of course, a whole literature of Chinese strategy, of Indian grand strategy, of Islamic grand strategy out there that is mostly not accessible to most of us because it hasn't been translated. We don't have the languages. So there's no question that that's a severe gap in our knowledge base. And particularly with the rise of China, but also the rise of India. It's something that I think the younger generation is going to have to give some attention to training in those languages is well worth the time it requires. And I'm happy to note that I think Chinese is now the second most studied language here at Yale. So that's all to the good, but that's a long-term solution. It's going to take quite a while for that literature to become accessible to us. I suspect, though, that once that happens, that many of the same principles that come out of the Western canon will, in one form or another, appear. And this is one of the things that I noticed about Sun Tzu, is that much of what he reduces to his pithy aphorisms is completely consistent with what's implicit, but at much longer, much greater length in Thucydides, or in Machiavelli, or in Clausewitz. And certainly this notion of proportionality, this notion of achieving what you want to achieve with the least possible damage to yourself, to the landscape, to the adversary even, which is deeply rooted in Sun Tzu, is also there in Clausewitz and in other great grand strategists, if you read them correctly. Clausewitz for years was mistranslated and misunderstood in that regard. But now with the great Michael Howard and Peter Perret translation, which has been around for about 30 years, that's accessible to us if you have the patience to wade through 600 pages. Proportionality is a very basic idea. And it was fascinating to me that the real architect of proportionality was St. Augustine. And his notion of when it is legitimate for a Christian to indulge in violence. And he made the point that, well, if Christians did not indulge in violence, if they simply turned the other cheek, as the founder of the religion recommended, there wouldn't be any Christians left. So some kind of a compromise here had to be made, and proportionality was the guide through that compromise for him. And that's why I have half of a chapter in the book on St. Augustine, even though I pair him with Machiavelli, which hasn't often been done before.
Sir, I just wanted to tell you that what I got from your book is that successful strategists were the ones that were humble. Specifically, I was thinking of Lincoln here. Am I reading too much into that point, or does humility have a role in the success of a grand strategy?
Sure, it has a role, because how can you be open to the possibility of surprise, to the open to the possibility of the unexpected, without maintaining a certain humility? Those who lack humility are those who think the world is completely predictable. So of course humility is important. I even went on to argue in the book that something called lightness of being is important as well. And by this, I mean the ability to look at yourself, to analyze yourself, maybe to laugh at yourself, to make fun of yourself. These are healthy characteristics. And so they're surprisingly often present in the great grand strategists. You know, it seems to me that Octavian Augustus had this. Certainly Elizabeth I had this. Lincoln had it. FDR had it. And it's interesting to contrast them with some of the great hedgehogs who totally lacked any kind of a sense of humor, you know, and this would certainly be Woodrow Wilson, for example, I think, Napoleon. You know, the people who got into trouble were the ones who did not have that kind of lightness. And I think it all makes sense, because if the idea is to be situationally aware of all the things that are around you, you can't do that if you are plumping or plopping around the landscape as a heavy weight, and you're sinking into the mire and all of this. And you have to somehow be above it. And I think that's the trick here.
I'm going to go back to the audience here before they bring me up for not asking their questions. Do you see the United States as having a grand strategy right now? Or do you believe the United States lacks a grand strategy?
I don't see one right now, in the sense that we have been talking about it. I see a lot of churning. I see a lot of chaos out there. I see the government being at odds with itself in several different ways. I don't want to take the position that our current leader did not start out with some kind of grand strategy, because I think actually he did. It seems to me that Donald Trump in the 2016 campaign saw something out there in the country that none of the other candidates, Democrat or Republican, saw. And he rode that to victory. So those were sensitive political antennae that he had. And it's fascinating to think about why everybody else's political antennae had become numb at that point, and they just completely missed what was happening in so-called flyover territory in the country. That having been said, Trump is a classic example, it seems to me, of someone who got into power because of a shrewd insight, but then has no clue as to what to do next. And that's where we are, it seems to me, right now. So things have reduced pretty much really to his getting reelected, and that's obviously a self-centered hedgehog-like view, and I hope he won't be, but I'm not betting on it in that sense. He's somebody said the other day, that cat has more than 9 lives.
So the next question comes from a professor at our Erie University in Montgomery, Alabama. He writes, the grand strategy of the US for the past 20 years, if there indeed has been one, seems to be based on preeminence and predominance in all spheres, military, economic, informational, diplomatic, etc. Putting on your fox hat for a second, in what realm should the US cede its predominance to rising powers, and more specifically China, so as not to bankrupt itself? Where should we be willing to assume greater risk?
Yeah, precisely. I would certainly agree that that perspective of seeking supremacy and trying to hold on to it has been the dominant theme since the end of the Cold War. We had an immensely successful grand strategy during the Cold War. And those who say democracies can't have such strategies, I think, simply fail to recognize the sophistication of the strategies that we did have, even messy as it looked like it was at the time. But that was a bipolar world at that point. There was an enemy out there. We could not claim supremacy over everything at that point, and suddenly we wound up with it in 1989, 91. Well, anybody who thought that was going to last was an idiot. It never does. It never has. And that kind of supremacy is a totally artificial situation. And it was, of course, to be expected that other powers, not then great, would return to the status of a great power. It was entirely predictable that the United States in that position would mismanage certain things and, if not self-destruct, at least partially destruct out of simply arrogance or failure to understand the transitory character of that kind of supremacy. So yes, that's the big issue now, and I wish it had surfaced as a bigger issue much earlier on, because it seems to me that anyone with a long historical view should have seen in the early 1990s that we were not going to be able to hold on to that artificial situation, and they should have been thinking about what kind of a world we would want in the post-Cold War era. Would some new bipolarity be the most stable situation? Would multipolarity be the proper approach, the most reasonable approach in that situation? Should the United States seek to manage everything or simply seek to balance the offshore balancing strategy? All of those things were out there and were debatable, but they never actually made it into any kind of a policy planning process to the extent that containment in the Cold War did. And so we got hung up on contradictions. The most remarkable one for me was the decision to expand NATO and the belief that somehow that would be consistent with maintaining a friendly relationship with Russia. And that's just not in the cards. And it should not have taken a rocket scientist to figure that out. So the rise of Putin, it seems to me, was a perfectly predictable result of our policies in the 1990s. Similarly, I think we faced with China a situation that is comparable in the sense that it does seem to me quite artificial to assume that we can continue to dominate as much of the Western Pacific as we have over the past 70 years or so, given the rise of Chinese military and particularly naval power. And I'm happy to see within the military and particularly within the Marines some rethinking of that proposition now. And I think there should be more of it. That's the kind of thing that we should be doing. The only problem is, of course, it's very difficult to do it politically. People fear losing face. People still think about credibility. But it seems to me that your credibility, and this is something George Kennan used to say, your credibility is much more enhanced by withdrawing from untenable positions rather than holding on to them. And I think that's what we should have been doing at this point. The current administration, I think, is not capable of doing it. Perhaps some new administration can begin to take it on and do it.
Our next question comes from one of our international partners. He asks, is it possible to have an effective and feasible grand strategy on global world threats such as terrorism?
It's difficult because you don't have a single adversary that you're confronting. You're trying to contain a concept, not something that's tangible. And so terrorism is always going to be a strategy, if you want to call it that, that's open to somebody, usually someone who is weak and has no other alternative, for sure. And to say that you're going to have a grand strategy against terrorism is just to say something like you're going to have a grand strategy against some very natural human trait, like stupidity or whatever. I think we have to be more precise than that. I think we have to ask, what are the ways in which the terror actually affects vital national interests? What are the zones of responsibility that we can feasibly yield to others, and what are the ones that we must hang on to? And if your answer is we must hang on to all of it, I would say that's ridiculous. You can't do that. So then where do you begin to draw the line? That is politically very, very sensitive, and particularly it can be sensitive in relations with allies. But this particular moment, when the geopolitical cards have been shuffled to the extent that they have over the last 4 or 5 years, may actually be an optimal point for rethinking that and deciding what is really important and what is less so. And I hope that will be the case.
Another question from the audience. This one is, says some academics and analysts advocate for certain grand strategic archetypes, such as cooperative security, primacy, selective engagement, isolationism, etc. How should a strategist think of these archetypes in the context of your fox and hedgehog framework?
Don't get imprisoned by them. Become the prisoner of your own archetype. Academics have vested interests in concepts like this. And you can always tell when they write their op-eds, are they repeating themselves? Well, yes, they often do. And that's because that's how they became known, from one particular concept, whatever that is. Concepts are useful as a way of distilling thought, but they're ill-equipped to deal with changing circumstances. And that gets back to the Clausewitzian side of the equation. If the concept is one that is adaptable to uncertainty and to the unforeseen, that's one thing. If the concept limits you to a certain kind of response, no matter what you're confronting, that's quite another thing. And this is where I would put the credibility issue once again as a very important dilemma, because we so easily fell into the notion, even in the Cold War, to give up anything, anywhere, would create a fatal, the falling of dominoes would create a fatal sense of that we could not be trusted, that we were no longer capable, that we were on the verge of impotence, and so on and so forth. And this very much informed our policy in Vietnam, for example, and it has had something to do with Iraq as well, it seems to me. So I do think that a clear-headed effort starting from scratch, just to try to identify vital interests and say some things are vital and some things are much less so. That's where we need to be at this point. And that needs to be thought of in not just in terms of concepts, but it needs to be thought of in terms of geography, logistics, technology, all of these different things. So it's a big task for those who would be doing strategic planning, that's for sure.
Combine one of our audience members' questions with one of my questions. So changing gears a bit, we hear a great deal now on great power competition. Can you explain why the theories and concepts presented in your book are relevant in this new era of GPC?
Well, there's nothing new about great power competition. If I had to say what is the most likely state of the world, what is the most likely world order in this period, I would say it's precisely that. It's competition among great powers. And the artificialities have come when there were only two great powers, or when there was only one great power. But the stable point, the default, really does seem to be 3 or 4 or 5 great powers. Who they are may well shift for one reason or another. But it seems to me that this should not surprise us at all. So then the question is, what kind of great power competition do you want? Well, presumably it would be a competition that does not escalate into self-destructive war, World War III or something maybe not quite so bad, but draining nonetheless. Presumably, in other words, it would be a competition conducted within certain rules, within certain restraints. Well, what do you have to get that? Does that mean that each of the great powers has to be like the other great powers, that they have to have common institutions, common principles, common standards of behavior or of morality or of human rights and all of those things? I think that's probably utopian. I think that that's unrealistic. Cultures are very important in the world. Certainly the study of history would suggest that. And different cultures attach different values to those concepts from what we attach to them. So it seems to me that some tolerance of different cultures, some acknowledgement of the possibility that different people have different ways of doing things, different people have different senses of priority, and so on, is part of where we need to go in making great power competition manageable. We shouldn't be out to change the world. We should be out to find a way to live within the world, but to do so safely and to do so within within a framework of prosperity and security and all of this, but without a framework of uniformity. So that's my sense of it. And I think that the great power competition, as managed, for example, by Metternich, or as managed by Bismarck or other great statesmen of the past, is probably the most realistic model. Where we find the Bismarcks these days is a different question, of course.
Sure. Another question from the audience. What role does bargaining play in developing modern grand strategies? In what way might this connect to proportionality?
Well, bargaining is obviously part of it, for sure, because you're always negotiating, you're always making trade-offs, and there's no way to escape that, it seems to me. However, I would caution against bargaining reduced to mathematical terms. I'm rather skeptical, for example, about game theory. I'm inclined to think that the study of bargaining should always be linked to historical realities rather than to abstract conceptions. So this is not something I would wish to turn over to artificial intelligence or to a computer or whatever. Bargaining, though, having said that, has always been with us. And deal making is part of that. This is what diplomacy is. And that should certainly continue, no question.
We have another question from one of our international partners. Interesting question. What is the prerequisite for a country to have a grand strategy?
That's a good question. I think the prerequisites are flexible. I think that even very small countries, if they have survived as small countries and retained their sovereignty and whatnot, have done so because they considered that survival important to themselves. And so by my definition, they had a grand strategy. So I think Singapore, for example, has had a grand strategy. I think Switzerland has had a grand strategy. And so I think that concept is broad enough to be able to apply across scale. It's not just something that big powers do. And the capabilities, aspirations problem is something that applies at all of those levels as well. So it seems to me that all countries need a grand strategy, need something like this. Many have them. Not all of them have been articulated very clearly. But looking back, it's for those that have survived, yes, of course they've had one. Otherwise, they wouldn't have survived, I think. So that would be my sense of this.
Here's a question from our audience. Have you given any thought to the idea of soft balancing as a foreign policy strategy that can provide guidance to the interagency in the absence of grand strategy?
Soft balancing or soft power?
Soft balancing.
Well, I'd want to know how that term is defined. But if what it means is the role of intangibles in this regard, sure, they exist and they have their place. But I just need to know more what the concept of soft balancing is and to what extent it's another way of talking about soft power.
Right. I imagine that they mean soft power, but
soft power, sure, soft power plays its role and does so very significantly, it seems to me. And what's fascinating to me now is the extent to which the Chinese have latched on to soft power. So they are using not just harsh means, but they are using the internet, they are using communications, they are using propaganda, they are using rock groups, music, all of this kind of thing. Look at what South Korea has done with boy bands, for example, and you see an example of soft power in form. And so I think what's interesting about the modern world is that whereas we used to be the masters of using culture in the broadest sense as an instrument of strategy, others have caught on to this now. So this is a more, I wouldn't say necessarily threatening, but it's a more sophisticated environment to operate in. I don't think the Russians have yet found much way to deploy soft power, but we'll see. Maybe their internet snooping is a form of that, but I think that's a little bit different from the Joe Nye's concept of soft power.
The questioner followed up with what his definition of soft balancing is: the purposeful creation of diplomatic and economic friction to frustrate, interrupt, delay a great power's initiatives.
Oh, I see. Okay. So soft sabotage then.
Right.
Like that.
Right.
Okay. I think you have to be very careful with this. We've done it. We used to call it covert action. And the record on it was decidedly mixed. I think that in bargaining, obviously threats, retaliation, all of this is part of the negotiating process. And that's certainly evident in economic policy, tariffs and that kind of thing. The deliberate infliction or cultivation of friction, making life difficult for another country, I think you have to ask to what end, because it does seem to me that at some point, if you make things difficult for another country, or make things too difficult for another country, you confront the interesting question, well, what if they collapse, then what? And we got into this with Russia. This was the question that came up with regard to the old Soviet Union. The Reagan administration having deliberately tried to make life as difficult as possible for the Soviet Union, but without much thought to what it would want to replace it with when it did collapse, you know. And so there was some floundering around on that issue for sure. So it's always good to ask the question, well, what happens when you get what you want? Then what? It's the question that Napoleon failed to ask when he got what he wanted, which was Moscow. Then what? Mm-hmm.
One question here from the audience: can a country such as China, with all its population control measures, coexist with a free world, or is this relationship destined to follow the same path as the Cold War and force a grand strategy of containment?
Well, first of all, the Cold War was coexistence. We did not have a world war. So it was a competitive coexistence, but it was coexistence. So I don't see why that model could not apply in this particular situation. It seems to me that the fundamental interests of both sides would lie toward coexistence. I think that the Chinese have no more desire to wipe us from the face of the earth than we do to wipe them from the face of the earth. And that, of course, was true in the Soviet-American relationship as well. And so out of that kind of situation, sometimes unwritten rules of the game can surface, as they did in the Soviet-American relationship. For example, don't shoot down reconnaissance satellites. Who decided that? Nobody. The technology developed, and then both sides found it extremely useful. And suddenly spying was a good thing, and a stabilizing thing. So these kinds of rules can emerge, and they don't always have to emerge through negotiations or treaties, it seems to me, in competitive relationships with great power. Competition and cooperation can coexist. And this may seem contradictory, but the whole premise of what I'm trying to say in balancing aspirations and capabilities is that wake up, life is contradictory, and it always will be. So to have all questions solved, it seems to me, is a kind of world that I think I would not want to live in.
For this next question, I think you'll find interesting. It sounds like a question you might receive in one of your classes at Yale. Administrations shift the focus of national security interests often, upending geopolitical relations. President Trump's administration, national security focus shifted the NSS, the NDS, the NMS from counterterrorism to great power competition. How do you develop a grand strategy that has a 4 or maybe 5 year shelf life without a common threat such as the Cold War?
Well, I think there's nothing wrong with short shelf lives if the reality itself out there has changed. We attached a great deal of importance in the first half of the 1940s to defeating the Germans and the Japanese. That was an overriding priority for everything. Did we hang on to it? Did we try to completely wipe them off the face of the earth? No, we didn't. We suddenly realized once 1945 rolled around, we needed the cooperation of those guys. We needed to get them on our side. So the whole premise of policy changed. And by the end of the 1940s, we were doing everything we could to rebuild Germany and Japan. And I think that's, there's nothing surprising about that. Life goes on, it changes, environments change, and it seems to be perfectly reasonable that strategic priorities change. I think the problem more often comes from rigidity in strategic priorities than from change in strategic priorities.
Sir, we've been going an hour now, and I just wanted to, finally, before we sign off, give you the opportunity to offer any closing comments.
Well, I think we've covered most of the things that I had wanted to talk about today. I have found this book on grand strategy difficult to lecture on. So I've stopped lecturing on it because I don't quite know what to say. I think it's a book that people will draw different things from, and that certainly reflects its origins in a seminar. I've never wanted my students to leave my seminars thinking that they had the solution to everything. I wanted them to leave questioning. I wanted them to leave arguing with each other. I wanted them to leave informed, but not committed to particular points of view. And I wanted them to leave in a way that would be adaptable for their futures as well. So that's what I would hope people would take from this book. And I hope maybe to some extent from our discussion today.
So your book on grand strategy provides the reader with a lot to consider. Specifically, I kept coming back to the U.S. national security strategy and national defense strategy, asking questions like, what did we get right? Where have we erred? And how do we improve? That in itself is probably the best compliment I can offer you for your book on grand strategy. It really does get people to think critically. And to anybody that gets me to think critically it's a great achievement, sir. So Professor Gaddis, thank you very much for sharing your time and expertise with us today.
Thank you, Pete. It was fun to do this.
It was fun for me as well. For the audience, for feedback on this session or any Think JSOU activity, please contact us at thinkjsou@socom.mil. I'd like to close now once again by encouraging everyone to explore the complete Think JSOU collection by subscribing through the library, APAN, or JSOU's social media sites. The US SOCOM Library is an exceptional resource for checking out electronic books or to download past and present JSOU monographs through the JSOU Press. You can always check out upcoming courses and events on our website, which is www.socom.mil/JSOU. This series is brought to you by the Department of Strategic Studies of the Joint Special Operations University. Thank you all for watching.